Every record you own and every song you've ever played and loved has a story behind it. Even the stuff that you may not know all that well from artists you may or may not be all that familiar with have got something to tell. And it's my job to sift through every single one of those stories one at a time. Welcome to Baxie's Musical Podcast. If you like what you hear today, please share it, rate it, review it, pass it along to all your friends, and be sure to follow the show on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook for regular updates on upcoming episodes. Today, we're brought to you by Metro Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, and Ram at Chicopee. Visit Metro's state-of-the-art dealership right next to BJ's and Big Y and Memorial Drive, or visit metrojeep.com and drive home in your new Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, and Ram today. And having said all of that, here's today's episode of Baxie's Musical Podcast.
It's Baxie's Musical Podcast.
Music is certainly no stranger to its share of tragic stories. We've all heard the cliches about the tortured, struggling artist desperately seeking validation and applause, which sometimes comes in limited amounts, even when it's the most deserved. But then there are some stories where the struggles are darker and far more complicated, where the music is being used perhaps as a coping mechanism to help sift through the weight and isolation of mental illness. Sadly, there are many times when the music alone simply isn't enough, and occasionally those stories end amidst incredibly tragic circumstances. Many of those tragic stories are very well known. Ian Curtis of Joy Division, Nick Drake, Kurt Cobain of Nirvana, and many more. But there also have been some that, for whatever reason, have been ignored, underreported, and in some cases completely forgotten. Artists who, in spite of their demons and self-destructive behavior, left behind a legacy of brilliant music that should have been more appreciated in its own time. Unfortunately, things don't always work out that way. And a good example of this would be the short but prolific career of Adrian Borland from the British post-punk band The Sound. If both the band or Adrian Borland are unfamiliar to you, you wouldn't be alone. In his time, Borland and The Sound were shamefully overlooked, and most people would agree that Adrian's brilliant music was timeless and that The Sound were an incredible band, both live and in the studio. But commercial success evaded the band partially due to the established music press and their insistence that Adrian just wasn't good looking enough to be successful, or that he was hampered by his weight issues. Others would focus on unfair comparisons, such as their label mate, Echo and the Bunnymen, a comparison which today seems totally unwarranted and somewhat ridiculous. The other issue working against Adrian Borland was his rapidly declining mental health, as he suffered from schizoaffective disorder for many years. Sadly, Adrian Borland took his own life in 1999 at the age of 41. But the music that he left behind was nothing short of brilliant, and what separates Adrian Borland from nearly everybody else was the sheer depth of emotion that he poured into every single song, as if music had been the only way he could express the pain and torment that eventually led to his death. In 2016, the documentary film Walking in the Opposite Direction was released about the life of Adrian Borland. But more recently, an exceptional biography has been released, which offers even greater insight and detail into the Borland saga. The name of the book is Destiny Stops Screaming: The Life and Times of Adrian Borland. It's a book that delicately portrays the discrimination, the demons, and the decline that surrounded one of music's great lost talents. And the author of that book is Simon Heavisides. He's my guest today on Baxie's Musical Podcast. I'm so glad that Neil Saint connected us together here, because I thought the book was exceptional. And
Thank you.
it's funny because I have a friend of mine who's also a rock biographer, and he and I had this conversation about a year or two ago. I said, your next book really should be about Adrian Borland, and he's like, I don't know. Thankfully, he didn't listen to me, but it's such a compelling story that I've always thought that that it really needed to be treated with real sensitivity, and I think you did that. What compelled you to write a story about Adrian Borland's life?
Oh, very good question. I think the first thing I have to say is I wouldn't have written the book if it wasn't for the person who asked me to do it. And that's a gentleman from Holland by the name of Jean-Paul van Mierlo. Basically, he administers Adrian's archive, and he's organized a whole series of reissues of albums. And I'd done a few things with him. I did some sleeve notes for one of the reissues. And about just over a year ago, he called me up and he said, I really think there should be a book. Would you write it? Which was a bit of a bolt from the blue, really.
Sure.
But my wife said, if you don't do it, you're crazy. So I think after a few hours, I basically said, yeah, okay. And that's how it started.
So I didn't have to twist your arm very hard to do it.
No,
Yeah.
you've got to do it, haven't you? I mean, how often are you going to get that chance?
Well, and to have a guy who is so, closely attached to, Adrian's archive. I mean, what a great resource to write a book like this. To have a guy that, at your disposal to really kind of get into the weeds on a very complicated story.
Absolutely, because people have said, "Who are you going to do next?" And I've said, "I think this might be a one-off because it was a really unusual situation." Although I did interview a few people again, he had a whole stockpile of incredible interviews that he'd done for the film that they made. And also, he had this fantastic interview with Adrian, which was done with Adrian James, who's a school friend of Adrian's, Jan, who was in The Outsiders with him. And this was, I can't remember how long, it was a few hours of just fantastic chat between the two of them down the pub. But it was just brilliant. I was honestly, I was typing so much from it because it was gold dust, and it had never been used.
You and I are the same age. I checked. We're the same age, and I only discovered the sound, just a few years ago. I think in the States, I mean, they didn't have the same kind of impact they would have had, say, like in the Netherlands, for example. So this is a relatively new discovery for me. You're just talking like maybe like 4 years or so. How did you get introduced to the sound and to Adrian's music?
Well, I think I started to read the music press here. This weird thing that we used to have here, these newspapers, the inkies as we call them, and I sort of became aware of this band. And in 1984, when they released Shock of Daylight, Alan Jones did this incredible review in the Melody Maker, and it was one of those reviews that you read, and you just think, I need that. I don't. I'd not heard any of it.
Right.
In those days, you didn't. I actually remember because I grew up in quite a small town, and I said to my parents, they were going into the local city, can you get me this album? Here's my paper round money. And they came back, and I put it on in my room up there, and I was just completely blown away. It was one of those things where you're like, my God, 6 songs, and I just love this record so much. I probably wore it out.
I don't know if my experience is any different. I was in college radio back in the '80s, and I remember at the radio station they had a copy of From the Lion's Mouth, and I was just I didn't know anything about it, so I just passed by it and didn't pay much attention to it. And then many years later, I'm looking at some list of like the greatest post punk records of all time, and there's that record, and I'm saying, well, I gotta just listen to this, and then I did. Same experience you had. I'm like 5 or 6 songs into it. I'm going, this is unbelievable. How can I have not known about this band for so long? But that's really not an unusual, experience with the sound or Adrian Borland's music.
No, that's true because I've been trying to promote the book because we've not got PR or anything, so I've been trying all kinds of things, and I posted on a forum the other day. And a couple of people, one person said, I literally discovered this band yesterday.
Yeah.
When I see that kind of thing, I'm just like, oh my God, this is, I mean, he would have been absolutely incredulous. And if you look on YouTube, I forget how many views, it might be 7 million. I can't remember. Oh, I might be wrong, but it's millions. I Can't Escape Myself from the first album. That seems to be the song that a lot of people coalesce around.
Yeah.
I don't think he wouldn't have been able to comprehend that.
Especially since he struggled so hard to get the respect that that music really deserved. I mean, it really kind of. I mean, it was the kind of narrative that followed him during his entire music career that he just was not getting, the recognition that that other bands of the time were getting, the Echo and the Bunnymen and U2, things like that. It's funny because as I've researched him more and more, I keep seeing the word, genius, and it's a word that I think is, thrown around really too easily. But you continuously hear it about Adrian Borland, and I wanted to ask you about it. Having researched his career and have been a fan of his music, I mean, how do you see him? I mean, do you think that's a fair title for Adrian Borland?
Um, it's so strange that you asked that because I had a review last week that was really critical of the book, and one
Hmm.
of the main areas of criticism was that I said that he was a genius. Now I don't. Adrian was exceptional, but I wouldn't hand out the. I think genius is Bowie, people of that sort. I think Adrian would not have wanted to be called a genius. I think I can't speak for him. I wasn't a close friend, but I just think he was an exceptional songwriter, guitarist, and he had a very clear vision of what he wanted to do. Now, I'm not going to say that's a genius because I don't think he would have described himself in that way. But God, he was extremely good at what he did, and he also had. There's a quality in his music, this sort of ability to write some pretty serious, near to the knuckle songs about emotional conditions, but he still manages to get that spark of sort of hopefulness in there.
Again, it's a very hard word to define or apply to anybody because I mean, you can always argue, forever what really makes a genius and what doesn't. But
Mm,
you know, there's such a prolific amount of music in which he's really just pouring himself out. I mean, there's a part in the book where he talks about if you want to understand who I am,
mm,
read the lyrics. Well,
mm.
that's fine if you're going to record two or three albums in your entire career, but we're talking lots of music and a lot of exposure and a lot of real real raw to the bone type of material. I don't know if that's what defines a genius, but most artists can't get that close to themselves and be that vulnerable as often as he did. And I think that may be what separates him from a lot of the other artists that we're talking about.
I think you've just made a pretty good case there.
I've been
You
thinking
might have
about it for
persuaded
weeks.
me here. Yeah. No, I think that is a really good point, and I think that he did experiment with other styles of music, even with other people singing the songs. But there's always that thread of Adrian Borlandness, if that's a terrible phrase, but that goes through the whole thing. I mean, I was incredulous that he'd done this bizarre sort of dance music thing that I couldn't get any of the recordings. What was it? Velcro Puppy.
Right.
I almost thought this has got to be an April Fool's, but apparently it was real.
Yeah. It's weird, when I listen to Jeopardy or From the Lion's Mouth, and based upon his reputation as a live performer, which was substantial. I mean, it was rave reviews about the Sound's live performances. You wonder why he didn't get greater recognition, and while some of that may have been self-induced, a lot of it seems to be based upon unfair comparisons and judgments, about the way he looked or whatever it may be. And as a fan to hear that, it's frustrating. I mean, never mind. I mean, I can't imagine how that must have affected him. I mean, you mention in your book multiple times about his weight being like the first thing that any journalist would talk about, and then you get all these all these comparisons to U2 and Joy Division and Echo and the Bunnymen. It's like that must have been so frustrating, and in a way, I find that to be kind of like a lazy way of writing about him because it's not it doesn't paint the entire picture at all.
I think that, I mean, I grew up and I read all that music journalism at the time. I don't think I realized, and it's not all the journalists, because some of the writing is brilliant, and I love how constructive and encouraging and enthusiastic. But some of the writing was horribly misogynist. Yeah, that's really bad. And yeah, I read some of this stuff where they mentioned his weight, and I thought, no way. I mean, I'm pretty glad. Surely we've left that behind now.
Right.
You know, I mean, I'm happy to be called woke if it means you don't write about an artist's weight, because it's just insane. I think that the reasons why, firstly, management, it's mundane things as well. I mean, their management was a car crash, really. Once their actual only real manager had gone, Steve Budd, they were never had a professional manager again. You
Yeah.
can't compete with U2. You can't compete with any. I mean, you can't compete with Spinal Tap. They've got a manager. You know, the sound didn't have a manager. It was
Yeah.
not going to happen. The thing is, and then the other problems, really stupid parochial problems that you get in England that you've. I don't know whether this applies in the States, but they didn't come from a cool area. That didn't help them.
Right.
If you look at the way the Outsiders were mocked when they were, a punky-ish band, they were mocked mercilessly. It was shocking. It was horrible because they were viewed as not cool. And I think when when the sound were emerging, they had that brief sort of honeymoon period. Maybe if they'd been on a cool indie with a bit of power, things might have gone differently. Maybe they weren't ever destined for that. Maybe they were only ever destined for people like you and me and those thousands of others who love them
Yeah.
absolutely did. Because if you think, sorry, you've got me going now.
No,
It's,
no,
it's
no.
funny when you write a book like that. I sat at this table doing it, and the amount of time I've spent thinking about all these things. But if you think of all the bands that probably sold, I don't know, truckloads of records in those years, who no one really loves anymore, and yet the sound, people are falling in love with them now.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned like the publicity machine behind it, like U2. Yeah, that I mean, that's a perfectly good example of a band that started off great, and Rattle and Hum came around, and then all of a sudden everyone
Yeah,
gets a free record on iTunes. It's like there's a lot of stumbles across the way, but they don't really have the same sense of wonder that a band like the Sound has, where when you discover you're just like, I can't believe I'm hearing this for the very first time. It's funny. I just interviewed Mark Burgess from the Chameleons, another band just criminally underappreciated. And I kind of put the Sound. If you want to make comparisons, I would make comparisons not musically, but at least career wise about the Chameleons and maybe the Sound. I mean, these are just two amazingly brilliant bands that, for whatever reason it may have been, self-induced or whatever, they just never got that commercial appreciation that their music so deeply deserved. And you mentioned that in your book about the Chameleons.
yeah. I mean, there's another incredible band. Although, ironically, they're playing to larger audiences here in the UK now than they
Yeah,
did when they existed the first time round. Obviously, there's a connection between Mark and Adrian. The thing is, though, Mike, I wonder. I mean, to be a huge band, I'm not saying. Obviously, there's some amazing bands that make it huge, but I think that there needs to be a very particular type of situation that occurs. And I think you need to, yeah, I don't want to say this too much. You do need to have quite simple songs that a lot of people are going to love. Am I saying that politely enough?
no, I
I'm
think
not
that's
trying to be a musical snob here, but
I do think that's true. I think in the case of the Sound, they didn't maybe have that anthem that other bands may have had, like Echo and the Bunnymen or something like that. But nevertheless, side by side comparison, to me they're complete equals, and
yeah,
it's very hard to say that one was better than the other. It's just but for whatever reason, music is just not a fair proposition
it's
for
not
people.
exactly. It's not. I
Yeah,
think as well. You look at what happened to Echo and the Bunnymen. They sort of reached this fantastic point. I don't want to digress too much, but then the wheels really came off when they couldn't follow Ocean Rain, and they did an album which was quite bland. And I think Adrian would never have done that. I think that's one thing. He had a very strict quality control, and he went. I mean, the sound split up before they got to that stage.
yeah.
He knew that it was time to go, and he did something completely different. And I think you look at the sounds, two most popular songs. I Can't Escape Myself and Winning. What holds your hope together? Make sure it's strong enough. Winning, but he's got that incredible element of it, it's a big anthemic song, but maybe there's too much doubt for people to be punching the air to that song because you're thinking, hold on a minute, am I okay? That's the kind of feel, and I Can't Escape Myself. Woo.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, just they're like devastating songs, emotionally. Which, it's one of the things I'm impressed with in the book is I think you do a remarkably great job and delicately, weaving, the parallels between his music and his declining mental health over, the period of time. And it clearly, I think one was channeling itself through the other, and you can see how the mental health that he struggled with was really showing through in a lot of those lyrics. So we mentioned, and there's a conversation in the book and also in the documentary, with his father, who despite
Mm.
his close involvement in Adrian's career in the beginning, and it was still a very very challenging, difficult relationship. But clearly you could see that the dad could see how his son was struggling, and how you could also see how wounded the father was, knowing that he was completely powerless to help Adrian through any of this.
Yeah.
I'm sure you probably felt the very same way when you're watching this, or talking to the people involved. It's like, man, maybe nothing could have been done, but he was very clearly giving you a window into what he was struggling with.
Well, it's really strange because when I watched the film, I actually thought to myself, there's too much about the mental illness in it.
Hmm.
And God, I was so wrong because, and I thought I'm going to make it all about the music. And as I interviewed people and used other interviews, the story took its own form. And it's funny because one person has criticized me for leaning too heavily on the tortured artist's mental illness thing, which is crazy because you cannot tell this story without it. If you left it out, it would be very strange, or you downplayed it because it takes its own role. And I think, as you sort of implied, I mean, I can't say for sure, and I don't know where the mental illness ends and the sadness about what was going on in his career, maybe difficulties with parents. That's what people's lives are like, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Well, I think I don't know how you can tell a story about a guy who commits suicide at the age of 41 and not explain what were the pieces that led up to that. And I think
Yeah.
in this story, like I said, I think you handle it in a very sensitive way without leaning one way or another. It wasn't a book about purely mental illness, but it really was about the book about an artist who was combining the music and the struggle that he was facing. It's a really hard thing to write about and do it correctly. And as I'm reading it, I'm going, Simon's doing this right. Simon's doing right by Adrian Borland in this regard, because it is such a challenging thing to do correctly. And the criticism that you may be receiving, I think, is kind of nonsense, because that's not how I read that book at all.
Well, I'm really pleased that you've said that because when I was writing it, I thought I can't sugarcoat this. Equally, I'm not going to play it up for dramatic effect. What on earth would be the point of that? It's going to have to tell its own story, and the people around are going to have to tell that story and how it affected them. And yeah, I was massively conscious of being respectful, but on the other hand, writing a book that's worth people reading to find out more.
Yeah.
I can't make judgments, and obviously, I read lots about. I've got family experience and mental illness, and I think in the end, I wanted to make sure that we weren't making black and white statements here. I think that some people have been nervous about the fact that there's an implication that his music didn't help him. Well, I don't think it's quite as clear as that. I think it's not so much that it didn't help him; it was essential.
Yeah.
But it became more and more that what we've been talking about, that intensity, to put that into the music, it came at a cost.
Well, I think, in a very real way, music for him was a coping mechanism, to deal with the emotional struggles that he was dealing with. And it's not really an unusual thing for many artists to do. And I think as he became
Mm.
sicker over time, the thing that I think is really interesting is, when you listen to some of his later, when you listen to his solo work, for example, Alexandria, or even the last album, 5 a.m., it seems to be, and maybe I'm just hearing more into this than is right, but it just seemed it was a little bit more lighthearted than some of the earlier stuff, and that then maybe there was some hopefulness in him. At the same time, there's some pretty significant decline in his health at that exact same time.
I think that Alexandria, he did try to go for something more optimistic, but the darkness was cutting in there as well.
Yeah,
And I think when I interviewed him, he said to me, he'd obviously been thinking of it very carefully. I think I mentioned it in the book, but he said that you have to be careful because sometimes, you know, you become your songs. And I
right.
think he was thinking, I'm singing these songs and it's making me worse. I mean, you only have to hear the final album, posthumous album, Harmony and Destruction. I think you have to be, it's a fantastic record, even though it wasn't completed. But if you start analyzing those songs, that is a person who was actually he was totally on the brink and he was singing those songs. I mean, it's no coincidence that the title of the book comes from that.
Towards the end of his life, he had, like we said, he'd been suffering, from a very depressive period for 15 years or longer. And he had made multiple attempts on his life, and also alcohol was playing into it. I mean, there was a real problem going on towards the end. And then finally, in April of 1999, he wound up successfully committing suicide. And it is impossible to speculate, I think, whether anything could have been done to stop him at that point. What would he have been? What would have been different had his music, been more commercially successful? If he had more validation, I personally don't know if it would have made much of a difference, because he was still suffering in a chemical way, and that his mental illness was always going to be a part of it, even if he had become successful. Again, it's all speculative, but what are your thoughts about that? Do you think the validation of a successful career would have changed the final outcome?
I think if they'd become huge, it would have been a disaster for him.
Yeah, that's kind of
He
what
would
I
have
thought too.
pressure. He would, and he was clever enough and aware enough of his condition that he didn't take drugs, because he knew if he took drugs, that was game over very quickly. He knew that. And I think if you were put into that thing of being out there with all the temptation and all the pressure of writing those songs, there's no way. I think for Adrian, though, he did crave the recognition. Why not? Why shouldn't he? In a way, almost the perfect situation for Adrian might have been something like he maybe could have had now, with the aid of the internet, that he could reach a a reasonable audience around the world, enough to record albums, sell enough, have a song sampled by Chemical Brothers. I think that probably would have been the happy medium for him.
Yeah.
But of course, back at the end there, he was down to the position where he was selling maybe 500 copies of an album.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously now you don't sell very many copies of albums, even if you're doing okay. But I think he probably could have made something. If you look at a singer like Ian McNabb of Icicle Works,
Hmm.
he's not a household name, but he's got enough fans around the world that he can sort of sustain himself. He's probably screaming at the moment. No, I haven't, but I think that probably would have maybe been the happy medium for
Yeah.
him. He could have collaborated with people much more easily. Yeah, I don't think Adrian being a huge star would have been. It would have been an absolute disaster, I think.
Yeah. There's a couple of interesting things that you put in the book, and I'm glad you did, because it forced me to go search these things out and listen to them, and it's really interesting. There's a couple of side projects that he did that were really interesting. I mean, the first one was Second Layer back in 1979, which is a huge departure from everything that people may know of Adrian and his music. I mean, it really does sound like the band Suicide in a lot of ways. But then there was also the Witch Trials collaboration with Jello Biafra from the Dead Kennedys and Morgan Fisher from Mott the Hoople back in '81, which is maybe the most depressing record thing he had ever done. And I just thought that was just a real interesting pivot for him because I mean he wasn't even the you don't become the lead singer when Jello Biafra's in your band. But tell me about those two projects. So they really are wildly off the wall.
Second Layer is a really intriguing one. That obviously he did with Graham, the bass player from the band, and they actually released their EP before the Sound.
Mm, right.
And that was at a time when you could press up an indie single and it would sell like a few thousand copies. I mean, everything was up for grabs. You get the impression with Second Layer, I think Adrian viewed that as business left unfinished. And I think the fact that Chemical Brothers took a passage of him singing from that first EP and put it in a single last year, that's very, when I heard they'd done that and I listened to it, I thought, oh, you won't be able to tell. And good God, you can tell. You can hear Adrian Baldwin singing on it. I did try to interview them about it, and it was promised, but it never happened because how on earth? I mean, I'm really impressed that they heard that track. They went, I thought, wow, respect to them. And I think, Adrian, right up until near the end, he still felt he should have done more of that. And the Witch Trials, I mean, that's just nuts. It shows how music was just pouring out of him at that time because that was knocked up virtually in a night after a gig.
Yeah. They're both so interesting compared to everything else that he ever done, solo work, the outside, it's so different that, when we talked about, you talked about genius. I mean, you're right. Music is pouring out of him and it's not just one thing or another, but that he had the capacity to do many different kinds of things. That's, to me, that's, another thing that validates, the moniker of genius.
Agree. I agree. And I think, when you look at Alexandria, which has just come out again, I think that was an album, with the benefit of hindsight, he really was quite brave with that because it was very different to the Sound, very strong, quite ambitious. He really wanted to do other things. But I think as well, the signpost to that was the album he did with Castle Webb, Craig Leone partner. Because you can hear him, I think maybe there, you can hear the guitar, and she covered Total Recall. And I think maybe he was planning ahead and thinking, I mean, it's amazing, Second Layer, I forgot that he'd actually planned to do something where he had other vocalists singing on songs, because he did the one track with that, with Phil King, who ended up in Lush a long time later, who was really helpful during the book. So I think there was so much going on. It's incredible.
It really is. I just picked this up not too long ago. Last year, there was a brand new box set of the Sound, the Static Record years, and and I've been listening to it a lot since we arranged the interview, and I mean, it represents like the last several releases from the Sound and a bunch of demos and unreleased recordings, and the tragedy of it is that I really felt listening to it that I have missed out on what Adrian Borland is about. And I'm glad I've been able to connect with it now, but I really feel like, well, where the hell have I been? Because it's just, it's so outstanding. And it's like surprisingly outstanding, not just that he was good, but that it was good so consistently and for so long. It's really it's a remarkable box set. And then having read the book is soon after receiving, it's like I was right in telling my friend that this was a book that really kind of needed to happen. That people do need to rediscover what Adrian, or discover for the very first time what Adrian Borland was really all about, because it's a tremendous catalog of brilliant stuff.
Do you know what I mean? Have you heard about how Taylor Swift, on her current album, she sings a song and mentions the band The Blue Nile? And their Spotify listening figures have gone through the roof. I feel that Adrian is like one viral TikTok away from just really amassing, the plays and becoming that much more known. I think a lot of people could easily fall for that. Let's face it, how much post-punk influenced music is there around now in what we would call the indie scene? A lot of it means that people would instantly hear the sound and think, "Oh yeah."
I don't disagree with you at all. It's again, it's like one of those bands to finally discover has been a real, real treat. Yeah, and having read the book, I mean, like I said, I was very impressed by it, and I thought it was very, very well done and very, very sensitive how you handled a lot of different aspects of his life. I know that the book has only been out for about a month or so, but I mean, as you're looking forward on things, I mean, have you considered what's next for you, or are you just going to continue to push this for a while?
I think we'll just promote this for a while. I mean, I do reviews and stuff, which is a lot easier. But I think I would have to think really carefully because I mean, I wrote the book in about 6 months plus a few months of like proofreading, tightening it up, and everything. And I think, like I say, part of it was having all that material there. I think there are a couple of bands that I would quite like to write their stories, but you have to think you would be basically saying, right, that's the next 2 to 3 years taken up because that's probably what it would take with some of these bands. I think this was a very particular situation that was just right time, right place, right people. Yeah. I mean, we'd like to, it's done really well. It's only been out actually three weeks, and we launched it at this event in Holland, which was on the 25th anniversary of Adrian's death. And it was, what a night it was. It was just incredible. Again, Jean-Paul arranged that, and it started and I felt quite choked at the beginning, but by the end of the evening, it was so celebratory. It was fantastic. I think we'll just see whether we can do anything else like that in other countries, perhaps. It always comes back to Holland though, because that's the place.
Yeah, well, they embraced him the quickest. The name of the book is Destiny Stops Screaming: The Life and Times of Adrian Borland. Simon, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. I wish you best of luck with the book, and I hope we can get a few more people to listen to Adrian's music finally.
I hope so. Great talking to you as well.
Absolutely, Simon. Thank you so much. The name of Simon Heavisides' book is called Destiny Stops Screaming: The Life and Times of Adrian Borland. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe to it, like it, share it, give it a big fat 5-star review, and be sure to follow on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. You can also email me at bax@rock102.com. I'd love to hear what you think. Thanks to Metro Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, and Ram in Chicopee, and thanks to you for listening to Baxie's Musical Podcast.